For nearly 2 years, a man carried around a mistake he didn't even know he had made. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a reckless executive gambling away company money. He wasn't a fraudster hiding secrets from investors. He was simply an employee sitting at a desk, drinking coffee, attending meetings, answering phone calls, and trying to get through another ordinary workday. And yet, by the time the story was over, his decision would be connected to a loss so large that most people will never earn that amount in 1,000 lifetimes. $217 million. Think about that for a moment. $217 million. Enough to buy private jets. Enough to build entire neighborhoods. Enough to change thousands of lives forever. Gone. Not because of a market crash. Not because of a cyber attack. Not because of a global recession. But because of something so small, so ordinary, and so easy to overlook that millions of people do it every single day. An email. A single message sitting quietly in an inbox. No flashing warning signs. No emergency alarms. No one running through hallways shouting that disaster was coming. Just a notification, a subject line, and a choice. Open it now, or deal with it later. The choice took less than a second. The consequences lasted years. What makes this story so fascinating isn't the amount of money that disappeared. It's that the warning arrived before the disaster. Long before it, the company had a chance to stop everything. Someone tried to raise concerns. Someone tried to point out a growing problem. Someone took the time to put their concerns into writing and send them to the people responsible for preventing exactly this kind of catastrophe. The message reached its destination. The system worked. The email was delivered. And then, nothing. No response. No follow-up. No action. The message simply blended into the background noise of hundreds of other emails arriving every day. At first, that seemed harmless. A delayed response wasn't unusual. People were busy. Deadlines were approaching. Meetings filled calendars. Projects demanded attention. Life moved on. But while everyone was focused on what seemed important, something else was quietly getting worse. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the warning remained buried, and the problem continued growing. The most chilling part of this story is that when investigators eventually reconstructed what happened, they discovered something almost impossible to believe. The disaster had not appeared suddenly. It had announced itself in advance. It had left clues. It had provided warnings. It had practically introduced itself before arriving. Yet somehow, the people who had every reason to see it never recognized what was right in front of them. And when the consequences finally arrived, they arrived all at once. Executives found themselves facing questions they couldn't answer. Lawyers became involved. Investigators started examining internal records. Shareholders demanded explanations. News outlets began reporting losses. Employees worried about their futures. And somewhere in the middle of it all sat an email that suddenly mattered more than anyone could have imagined. An email that had been there the entire time. Waiting. Unopened. Ignored. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next would reveal how one overlooked warning became one of the most expensive lessons in corporate history. And the closer investigators looked, the more disturbing the truth became. The company didn't lose $217 million because of one email. It lost $217 million because of what that email was trying to prevent. And once you see how it all unfolded, you'll understand why some of the people involved still refuse to talk about it today. To understand how a single unread message became the center of a multi-million-dollar disaster, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to a company that appeared successful. Back to a time when nobody believed anything was wrong. Back to the moment the clock quietly started ticking. The strange thing about disasters is that people often imagine them arriving like earthquakes. Loud, sudden, impossible to miss. But when investigators later reconstructed the timeline of this story, they discovered that the warning signs had arrived quietly, one after another, long before the headlines, the lawsuits, and the $217 million loss. And that raises a question that still frustrates many of the people who studied this case. Was this simply human error? Or was it something much worse? Because somewhere inside a corporate office filled with experienced professionals, an important warning had been delivered and then forgotten. Nobody deleted it. Nobody flagged it. Nobody escalated it. It simply disappeared into the endless flow of daily business. And for a while, that seemed insignificant. After all, thousands of emails are sent inside large corporations every single day. Most of them never change anything. Most are routine updates, meeting requests, project discussions, and status reports. So why did this particular message matter? Why would investigators eventually spend months examining a single email? Why would lawyers reference it? Why would executives be questioned about it? And why would shareholders later point to that exact message as one of the most expensive missed opportunities in company history? The answer begins with the person who sent it. Because this wasn't a random complaint from an outsider. It wasn't spam. It wasn't a misunderstanding. The sender understood the company. The sender understood the system. And most importantly, the sender understood the risk, long before anyone else did. At the time, however, very few people realized that. The company appeared healthy. Revenue looked strong. Growth targets were being met. Investors remained confident. Executives were focused on expansion and future opportunities. From the outside, there seemed to be no reason for concern. But appearances can be misleading. Because while leadership focused on growth, another problem was quietly becoming larger. Not overnight. Not in a dramatic way, but gradually. The kind of problem that is easy to dismiss because today looks almost identical to yesterday. The kind of problem that doesn't create panic until it's already too late. And according to records later examined by investigators, the email attempted to draw attention to exactly that issue. The sender wasn't predicting a specific dollar amount. The sender wasn't claiming that the company would lose $217 million. But they were pointing toward a weakness. A weakness that had the potential to create consequences far greater than anyone imagined. At first, nobody treated the warning as urgent. That decision would become incredibly important later. Because once the crisis finally arrived, investigators began asking a simple question. Who knew? And when did they know it? The deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable the answers became. Internal communications revealed discussions that had never reached senior leadership, concerns that had never been fully addressed, warnings that had been acknowledged but never resolved. And sitting among those records was the email that started it all. The same email that had been overlooked. The same email that had quietly waited in an inbox while the clock kept ticking. By now, you might be wondering what exactly was inside that message. What could possibly have been so important that years later people would still be talking about it? The answer is both fascinating and terrifying. Because buried inside that email was a warning that predicted the future almost perfectly. Not every detail, not every consequence, but enough that when investigators compared the warning against what eventually happened, the similarities were impossible to ignore. It was as if someone had been handed a glimpse of the future and then chosen to look the other way. And what happened next would turn a forgotten email into the centerpiece of one of the most expensive lessons a company could ever learn. But to understand why that warning mattered so much, we first need to understand the company itself, the people running it, and the culture that allowed such an important message to go unanswered. To understand how a single email could eventually become connected to a loss of $217 million, we need to step back to a time when nobody was talking about lawsuits, investigations, or corporate failures. We need to go back to when the company looked like a success story. At the center of that success was a respected executive we'll call Michael Carter. Michael wasn't the kind of leader who attracted controversy. Colleagues described him as calm, disciplined, and highly competent. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, earning a reputation for making smart decisions and delivering results. Investors trusted him. Employees respected him. Industry analysts frequently pointed to the company as an example of effective leadership and strong execution. And from the outside, the numbers seemed to support that reputation. Revenue was climbing. Quarter after quarter, earnings reports painted an encouraging picture. Shareholders were happy. Expansion plans were moving forward. New clients were being added. Industry publications highlighted the company's growth. Business television programs discussed its future potential. Competitors watched carefully as the company continued gaining market share. For Michael Carter and his leadership team, it appeared as though years of hard work were finally paying off. Inside corporate headquarters, the mood was optimistic. Departments were growing. Budgets were expanding. Recruiters were hiring. Executives were discussing future opportunities rather than worrying about survival. The atmosphere reflected confidence. Not arrogance. Confidence. The kind of confidence that develops when a company experiences success for an extended period of time. And that confidence would eventually become one of the most important parts of this story. Because history has a way of showing that organizations rarely fail when everyone believes they are in danger. They often fail when everyone believes everything is under control. As the company continued growing, small warning signs began appearing. At first, they seemed insignificant. A technical issue here, a delayed report there, an internal complaint that never appeared serious enough to demand immediate attention. None of these incidents generated panic. None seemed connected. Most employees viewed them as routine business challenges, the sort of problems every large organization experiences. But what nobody realized at the time was that these seemingly unrelated issues were beginning to form a pattern that only became obvious after the damage had already been done. Months before the email arrived, certain employees had already started noticing inconsistencies. Systems occasionally behaved in unexpected ways. Internal controls sometimes failed to catch mistakes they were designed to prevent. Departments responsible for monitoring risks occasionally raised questions that remained unresolved. Meetings ended with promises to revisit concerns later. Reports were filed. Recommendations were documented. Follow-up discussions were scheduled. Then deadlines shifted. Priorities changed. Attention moved elsewhere. The concerns remained. The company continued generating profits, which made those concerns easier to dismiss. After all, when revenue is increasing and investors are celebrating, small problems can feel less urgent. Success has a way of creating its own form of blindness. Not because people stop caring, but because success convinces people that the system is working. And when people believe the system is working, they become less likely to question it. That mindset slowly spread throughout the organization. Nobody believed a disaster was approaching. Nobody imagined investigators would one day examine internal emails and meeting records searching for answers. Nobody expected shareholders would later demand explanations about decisions made during this period. To most people inside the company, the future looked bright. Yet hidden beneath the positive headlines and growing profits, tiny cracks had already begun forming. A delayed response, an overlooked concern, an unresolved issue. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they were becoming something much more dangerous. And then came the email. The same email investigators would later describe as one of the clearest warnings in the entire timeline. The same email that arrived before the crisis. The same email that tried to draw attention to a problem few people fully understood. When it first appeared in an inbox, it looked ordinary. By the time the truth emerged, it would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire story. At first, nobody paid attention. Soon, nobody would be able to ignore it. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. There was nothing remarkable about the day. No emergency meetings. No breaking news. No indication that anyone inside the company was about to make a decision that would eventually become part of a $217 million disaster. Employees were settling into their routines. Phones were ringing. Calendars were packed. Project deadlines were approaching. Like most large organizations, the company generated an endless stream of communication every hour. Hundreds of messages moved between departments. Reports were shared. Questions were answered. Meetings were scheduled. And somewhere among all of that activity, a new email quietly appeared. The sender was a mid-level risk analyst we'll call Daniel Reeves. Daniel wasn't famous inside the company. He wasn't a senior executive. He wasn't someone who regularly appeared in board meetings or investor presentations. Most people outside his department had probably never heard his name. But Daniel had something that many executives did not. He had a front-row seat to a growing problem. For months, he had been reviewing data, monitoring internal systems, and documenting inconsistencies that didn't make sense. At first, he assumed the issues were temporary. Every company experiences occasional glitches. Every organization encounters operational challenges. But the more Daniel investigated, the more concerned he became. Patterns started emerging. Small failures that seemed unrelated began appearing connected. Minor issues that had once looked harmless started pointing toward a larger weakness. And unlike many employees who simply noticed the problems and moved on, Daniel kept digging. What he found convinced him that someone needed to act immediately. So he wrote an email. Not an angry email. Not an emotional email. Not a message filled with dramatic predictions. In fact, one reason the email failed to attract attention was because it sounded so professional. The subject line was simple. The language was measured. The tone was respectful. There were no capital letters, no threats, no demands, no dramatic warnings about catastrophic losses. Instead, Daniel did what professionals are trained to do. He presented evidence. He outlined concerns. He explained potential risks. And he recommended immediate review. To him, it seemed obvious. The issue deserved attention. The data supported his concerns. The longer the company waited, the greater the potential consequences. Before sending the message, Daniel reviewed it several times. He wanted to make sure every claim could be supported. He wanted the information to be taken seriously. Most importantly, he wanted decision-makers to understand that delaying action carried risks. Once he was satisfied, he pressed send. The email traveled through the company's network and landed exactly where it was supposed to. Delivered. Received. Waiting. If someone had opened it immediately, they would have seen a detailed summary of concerns that had been developing for months. If someone had reviewed the supporting information, they would have discovered vulnerabilities that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. If someone had escalated the issue, the story you are hearing today might never have happened. But none of that occurred. Because at the exact moment Daniel's email arrived, the people responsible for reviewing it were overwhelmed with other priorities. Executives were preparing presentations. Managers were attending meetings. Departments were racing to complete projects before upcoming deadlines. The company's continued success created an atmosphere where urgent business opportunities seemed far more important than internal warnings. And so the email entered the same crowded inboxes that received dozens, sometimes hundreds, of messages every day. One new notification among many. Easy to postpone. Easy to revisit later. Easy to forget. At first, that decision didn't seem significant. Hours passed. No response. Then a day. Then several days. Still nothing. Daniel assumed people were reviewing the information. Surely someone would respond. Surely someone would ask questions. Surely someone would want clarification. But the response never came. The silence continued. And while the inbox remained quiet, the underlying problem continued growing. What makes this moment so unsettling in hindsight is that investigators would later compare Daniel's warning against the events that followed. The similarities were astonishing. The risks he identified, the weaknesses he described, the consequences he feared. Many of them eventually happened. Not exactly as he imagined, not on the timeline he expected, but close enough that the email would later become one of the most scrutinized documents in the entire investigation. At the time, however, nobody could see the future. Nobody knew they were standing at a crossroads. Nobody understood that a message buried beneath routine business correspondence would one day become evidence. Daniel had raised concerns. He had requested immediate review. He had suggested urgent action. And then the warning disappeared into silence. While executives focused on growth, deadlines, and quarterly targets, the clock kept ticking. And with every passing day, the cost of ignoring that message became more expensive than anyone could possibly imagine. The most expensive mistakes in business rarely happen in a single moment. They happen slowly, quietly, one overlooked decision at a time. In the days following Daniel Reeves' email, nothing appeared unusual. The company continued operating exactly as it had before. Executives attended meetings. Departments pursued growth targets. Investors remained optimistic. Quarterly projections looked strong. If someone had walked through the corporate headquarters during that period, they would have seen a thriving organization moving confidently toward the future. And that was precisely the problem. Because when nothing appears broken, few people feel urgency to fix anything. 1 week passed, then another. Daniel occasionally checked his inbox, expecting questions or requests for additional information. None came. The warning remained buried beneath newer emails, newer priorities, and newer distractions. As the weeks turned into months, the issue Daniel had identified refused to disappear. Instead, it evolved. What had once been a manageable concern gradually became something larger, something more expensive, something far more difficult to control. At first, the signs were subtle. A customer complaint that seemed isolated, an operational issue that appeared temporary, a discrepancy that required additional review. Individually, none of these events caused alarm. Collectively, they were telling a story. The problem was that nobody was connecting the pieces. Inside large organizations, information is often scattered across departments. One team sees part of the picture. Another team sees something different. Rarely does anyone see everything at once. And during this period, that lack of visibility would prove incredibly costly. As more incidents appeared, employees began discussing concerns privately. Nothing dramatic, just quiet conversations, questions, observations, a growing feeling among certain teams that something wasn't quite right. Years later, when investigators interviewed former employees, many described a similar experience. They couldn't point to one specific event. They couldn't identify one moment when they knew disaster was coming. Instead, they remembered a collection of small incidents that felt unusual, a report that raised questions, a system behaving unexpectedly, a process producing results that didn't make sense. Looking back, those moments appeared obvious. At the time, they were easy to dismiss. One former employee would later describe the situation in a way that perfectly captured the atmosphere inside the company. He said it felt like hearing strange noises inside a house. At first, you assume it's nothing. Maybe the wind, maybe the pipes, maybe something harmless. Only later do you realize those sounds were warning you that something was wrong. By then, the damage may already be underway. That description fits this story remarkably well, because while employees noticed isolated problems, the underlying weakness continued expanding. Every month that passed without action increased the company's exposure. Every unresolved issue created new opportunities for failure. Every delay made the eventual consequences larger. Still, management remained focused elsewhere. The company's success continued creating a false sense of security. Revenue figures remained encouraging. Expansion efforts moved forward. Investors showed confidence. From a leadership perspective, there appeared to be little reason for concern. And when organizations are growing, warning signs often struggle to compete with good news. Good news attracts attention. Good news reinforces confidence. Good news validates existing decisions. Warnings, on the other hand, often require people to slow down, reconsider assumptions, and confront uncomfortable possibilities. That rarely happens unless there is undeniable evidence. Unfortunately, by the time undeniable evidence arrived, it would already be too late. Months after Daniel sent his email, the issue he had identified was no longer theoretical. It was beginning to affect real operations. Customers started noticing inconsistencies. Internal teams spent increasing amounts of time addressing unexpected problems. Resources that should have been devoted to growth were being redirected toward damage control. The costs remained hidden for now, but they were accumulating. One decision after another. One delay after another. One missed opportunity after another. And still, the warning sat quietly in company records. Waiting. Ignored. The cruel irony is that everyday leadership believed they were protecting the company's future by focusing on growth. In reality, the future was being threatened by a problem they hadn't fully recognized. And because the consequences developed gradually, nobody could see how close they were getting to the point of no return. The clock kept ticking. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The vulnerabilities Daniel had described continued growing stronger. The opportunities to prevent disaster became fewer. The eventual cost became larger. Then came the moment everything changed. The moment when isolated concerns transformed into a crisis. The moment when executives finally began asking the questions they should have asked months earlier. The moment when leadership realized something was wrong. But by then, the damage had already started. For months, the warning had been sitting quietly in company records. For months, the concerns Daniel Reeves raised had been competing with deadlines, meetings, growth targets, and the endless distractions that consume large organizations. And for months, the company had convinced itself that tomorrow would look very much like today. Then one morning, it didn't. No disaster announcement arrived in advance. No executive woke up expecting catastrophe. In fact, the day began like countless others before it. Employees logged into their systems. Managers reviewed schedules. Executives prepared for meetings. Customers conducted business as usual. Everything appeared normal. Until suddenly it wasn't. The first signs of trouble emerged shortly after markets opened. At first, they seemed like routine technical issues. Small irregularities. Minor discrepancies. Nothing that immediately suggested the company was about to experience one of the most expensive failures in its history. But as technicians began investigating, a disturbing reality started to emerge. The issue wasn't isolated. It wasn't temporary. And it wasn't correcting itself. Within minutes, Internal systems started producing results nobody could explain. Transactions appeared where they shouldn't have. Processes that were supposed to prevent errors failed to activate. Safeguards that management believed were protecting the company simply weren't working. Employees began calling one another. Managers requested updates. Technical teams rushed to understand what was happening. And as more information arrived, the situation became increasingly alarming. The problem wasn't staying contained. It was spreading. Fast. Inside headquarters, confusion quickly turned into urgency. Conference rooms filled. Emergency calls were scheduled. Senior leadership demanded answers. But nobody had them. At least not yet. The company had spent years building systems designed to handle risk. Years developing procedures meant to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. Yet somehow, those protections were failing one after another. The clock was now moving against them. Every passing minute increased the damage. Every delay made the situation worse. Then came the realization that changed everything. The issue wasn't merely operational. It was financial, massively financial. The failures occurring inside the system were translating directly into losses. Real money, real transactions, real consequences. And the numbers were climbing at a frightening pace. The first estimates were difficult to believe. Executives assumed there must be a mistake. Surely the calculations were wrong. Surely someone had misread the data. Surely the actual losses couldn't be that large. But the numbers kept growing. And every update brought worse news. Meanwhile, phones throughout the company were ringing constantly. Customers demanded explanations. Partners wanted answers. Investors sought reassurance. Employees looked to leadership for direction. Leadership looked to technical teams for solutions. And technical teams were racing against time. Outside the company, the first rumors began spreading. Financial reporters noticed unusual activity. Industry analysts started asking questions. Market observers recognized that something significant was happening. Soon, those rumors became headlines. Then breaking news. Then national attention. The story was no longer confined to conference rooms and internal emails. The world was watching. As news spread, investor confidence began collapsing. The stock price reacted immediately. Shares that had once reflected optimism now reflected fear. Every new development intensified concerns. Every unanswered question created additional uncertainty. And uncertainty is something financial markets rarely tolerate. Inside headquarters, executives faced a nightmare scenario. Not only were they losing money, but they still didn't fully understand why. Imagine standing inside a building, watching water pour through the ceiling, while nobody can identify where the leak is coming from. That was the situation confronting leadership. The damage was visible. The source remained unclear. And until the source was identified, stopping the damage became nearly impossible. Hours felt like minutes. Minutes felt like seconds. The crisis moved faster than anyone anticipated. The losses continued mounting. $20 million. The figure shocked executives. Emergency discussions intensified. Surely this was the worst of it. It wasn't. The number climbed again. $50 million. At this point, concern became panic. Every department understood the seriousness of what was unfolding. Every decision suddenly carried enormous consequences. Still, the losses continued. $100 million. The figure seemed unreal. Employees stared at screens struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. Executives who had spent decades building successful careers found themselves confronting a disaster unlike anything they had experienced before. Yet even then, the bleeding hadn't stopped. The numbers kept rising. $150 million. By now, the company was fighting for survival. Every available resource was being deployed. Every possible solution was being considered. Every minute mattered. And throughout the chaos, one uncomfortable question lingered in the background. Could this have been prevented? As investigators would later discover, that question would lead them back to Daniel Reeves, back to the concerns he documented, back to the warning that had arrived months earlier, back to the email that nobody treated as urgent. But on this day, nobody was thinking about forgotten emails. They were focused on the catastrophe unfolding in real time. Then the final estimate arrived. The room fell silent, because the number staring back at them was larger than anyone imagined. Not 20 million, not 50 million, not 100 million, not even 150 million. The total loss had reached an astonishing figure, $217 million. And for the first time, Leadership began to understand the true scale of what had happened. The crisis was no longer a possibility. It was a reality, and the search for answers was about to begin. The morning after the company revealed the scale of the disaster, the atmosphere inside headquarters felt completely different. The confidence that had defined the organization for years was gone. In its place was uncertainty, fear, and a single question that nobody seemed able to answer. How had this happened? The financial loss alone was devastating. $217 million had vanished. Investors were demanding explanations. Customers were losing confidence. Employees were worried about their futures. Board members wanted accountability. And outside the company, regulators had begun paying attention. What had started as an internal crisis was rapidly becoming a public one. Within days, government regulators requested documents. Independent law firms were brought in. Outside consultants were hired. Forensic specialists began examining records. The company's leadership understood that simply stopping the immediate crisis wasn't enough. They needed answers. The board wanted a complete reconstruction of events. Every decision, every warning, every missed opportunity, everything had to be examined. And so the investigation began. The process was painstaking. Investigators weren't looking for opinions. They were looking for facts. They wanted evidence. Timelines, records, communications, anything that could explain how a successful company had suddenly lost $217 million. The first phase focused on understanding the disaster itself. Technical experts analyzed systems. Financial specialists reviewed transactions. Auditors examined controls. Lawyers interviewed employees. Slowly, a timeline started taking shape. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the story became. This wasn't a disaster that appeared without warning. Again and again, evidence suggested there had been opportunities to intervene, opportunities to ask questions, opportunities to investigate concerns, opportunities to take corrective action. Some had been missed. Others had been delayed. Many had simply faded into the background of daily business operations. The investigators kept moving backward through the timeline. Every answer generated new questions. Who knew about the vulnerabilities? When did they learn about them? Who received reports? Who reviewed them? Who decided they weren't urgent? And perhaps the most important question of all, could this have been prevented? At first, the evidence appeared scattered. Meeting notes, internal memos, risk assessments, performance reports, individual conversations recalled by employees. None of it seemed dramatic on its own. But when placed together, patterns began emerging. The same concerns appeared repeatedly. The same weaknesses surfaced in multiple departments. The same unanswered questions kept returning. One investigator later described the process as assembling a giant puzzle. Each document revealed only a small piece of the picture. But as more pieces were added, the overall image became impossible to ignore. The company had received warning signs. More than once. What nobody knew yet was whether anyone had recognized how serious those warnings actually were. As interviews continued, employees provided additional context. Some remembered concerns being discussed informally. Others recalled meetings where risks were mentioned but never fully explored. Several described an environment where growth targets often received more attention than operational concerns. Nobody suggested intentional wrongdoing. What emerged instead was something more complicated. A culture where small concerns struggled to compete against immediate business priorities. A culture where warnings could exist without creating urgency. And that realization made investigators even more determined to locate the earliest signs of trouble. The search expanded. Thousands of documents were reviewed. Communication logs were analyzed. Archived records were examined. Email servers were searched. Every relevant conversation became part of the investigation. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Then came a breakthrough. Investigators uncovered a collection of communications that immediately attracted attention. Unlike the fragmented clues they had seen before, these documents were direct, specific, detailed. Most importantly, they predated the disaster by months. Suddenly, the timeline became much clearer. There had been warnings, clear warnings, warnings supported by evidence, warnings that identified many of the same weaknesses investigators were now studying after the fact. The discovery changed the entire investigation, because now the question was no longer whether someone had seen the danger. The question became whether someone had ignored it. Investigators started tracing the path of these communications through the company. Who received them? Who reviewed them? Who had responsibility for acting on them? The answers led them deeper into the organization's internal records. And eventually, they found themselves examining a message that had been sitting quietly in company archives all along. A message sent months before the crisis. A message written by Daniel Reeves. A message that contained concerns investigators now recognized immediately. The room reportedly fell silent as they read it. Because line by line, warning by warning, the similarities between Daniel's concerns and the disaster that followed were impossible to dismiss. The risks he identified, the vulnerabilities he documented, the consequences he feared, they were all there, waiting. Months before the company lost $217 million. Months before the headlines. Months before the investigations. Months before executives were forced to explain themselves. And as investigators stared at the document, one realization became unavoidable. They had finally found the moment where this story truly began. Then they found the email. The moment investigators found Daniel Reeves' email, the entire case changed. Up until that point, much of the investigation had focused on understanding how the disaster happened. Now the focus shifted to something even more uncomfortable. Whether it should have happened at all. The email was immediately circulated among investigators, attorneys, auditors, and senior decision-makers involved in reviewing the company's collapse. What they discovered inside that message was astonishing. Not because Daniel had predicted every detail. Not because he somehow knew the company would lose exactly $217 million. But because the core warning was so accurate that reading it after the disaster felt almost surreal. Months before the crisis, Daniel had identified weaknesses that many people believed were manageable. Months before the headlines, he had documented vulnerabilities that leadership failed to prioritize. Months before the financial losses, he had warned that the company's existing safeguards might not function as expected under pressure. And now investigators were comparing his concerns against what actually happened. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Line by line, the email seemed to describe pieces of the future. The first warning Daniel raised involved system vulnerabilities that could create uncontrolled failures if left unresolved. Months later, those same vulnerabilities played a direct role in the crisis. Another section highlighted weaknesses in oversight and monitoring procedures. Investigators later discovered those exact weaknesses had delayed the company's ability to detect and respond to problems. Daniel also questioned whether certain safeguards would perform effectively during a major operational event. The disaster proved they would not. Again and again, the pattern repeated itself. Warning, delay, failure, loss. The people reviewing the evidence found themselves comparing two timelines. One timeline showed Daniel's email. The other showed the actual sequence of events that led to the company's collapse. What shocked them was how closely the two matched. On one side sat the warning. On the other side sat the disaster. The connection was impossible to dismiss. And as word spread through the company, emotions began running high. Executives who had spent months defending their decisions suddenly found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. Questions that became harder to answer every time someone reread the email. Employees reacted differently. Many felt frustrated. Some felt betrayed. Others simply felt exhausted. For months they had lived through uncertainty, layoffs, public scrutiny, and constant media attention. Now they were learning that someone inside the company had tried to raise concerns before everything went wrong. That realization was difficult to process. Shareholders were even angrier. Many had lost substantial amounts of money. Some had invested in the company for years. They had trusted leadership. They had believed the organization was being managed responsibly. Now they were discovering evidence suggesting the warning signs existed long before the disaster occurred. Every new revelation increased pressure on senior management. Board members demanded explanations. Lawyers prepared for potential legal battles. Regulators expanded their inquiries. And throughout it all, Daniel Reeves' email remained at the center of the discussion. The document that nobody paid attention to had suddenly become the most important document in the entire investigation. Yet despite the shock surrounding the email, investigators weren't finished. In fact, they were only beginning to understand how deep the problem actually went. Because once they confirmed that Daniel's warning had been accurate, another question emerged. A far more troubling question. Was this truly the first warning? Or had there been others? Investigators returned to the records. They searched older communications, archived reports, internal reviews, risk assessments, meeting summaries, anything that might reveal what people knew before the disaster. What they discovered would completely change the narrative. Because Daniel Reeves wasn't the only person who had expressed concern. He wasn't the only employee who noticed weaknesses. And he wasn't the first person to raise questions. As investigators dug deeper into the company's history, they uncovered evidence suggesting that the warning signs stretched back even further than anyone realized. Months before Daniel's email. In some cases, years. Concerns had surfaced. Reports had been written. Questions had been asked. Recommendations had been made. Many were acknowledged. Some were discussed. Very few were fully addressed. Suddenly, the story was no longer about one ignored email. It was becoming a story about a company that repeatedly postponed uncomfortable conversations. A company that kept choosing growth over caution. A company that mistook temporary success for long-term safety. And that realization sent investigators down an entirely new path. Because if Daniel's email wasn't the beginning of the story, then the real story was much bigger than anyone imagined. And what they uncovered next was even more damaging than the email itself. Because investigators discovered something even worse. For most of the investigation, attention remained fixed on Daniel Reeves' email. It was understandable. The document had become the symbol of everything that went wrong. It contained warnings. It identified vulnerabilities. It outlined risks that later became reality. To many observers, the story seemed straightforward. A warning was sent. The warning was ignored. The company lost $217 million. Case closed. But investigators weren't satisfied with simple explanations. The deeper they dug into the company's history, the more they realized that Daniel's email wasn't the beginning of the story. It was merely the warning that happened to survive. The warning investigators could easily find. The warning that existed in writing. And that discovery led to one of the most uncomfortable revelations in the entire case. Daniel Reeves wasn't the first person to notice the problem. He wasn't the first employee to raise concerns. And he wasn't even the first person to suggest corrective action. Months before Daniel's email, other employees had documented issues. Some of those concerns appeared in internal reports. Others surfaced during meetings. A few had been discussed during routine reviews. Each warning seemed small when viewed individually. Each appeared manageable. Each could be postponed until a more convenient time. That was the pattern investigators kept finding. Nobody looked at a warning and decided to create a disaster. Nobody intentionally chose to lose $217 million. Instead, what they discovered was something far more human and far more dangerous. People delayed decisions. Managers postponed discussions. Departments assumed someone else was handling the issue. Executives focused on immediate priorities. Teams addressed symptoms while underlying problems remained unresolved. One delay became another. One postponed discussion became another postponed discussion. One unresolved concern became several unresolved concerns. And because nothing catastrophic happened immediately, the decisions felt reasonable. That's what made the revelation so powerful. The catastrophe wasn't caused by one dramatic mistake. It wasn't caused by one careless employee. It wasn't caused by one reckless executive making a terrible decision on a single afternoon. It was caused by dozens of small decisions. Decisions that seemed harmless at the time. A report reviewed later. A meeting postponed until next week. A recommendation that stayed buried inside a document. An email marked for follow-up. A concern acknowledged but never fully addressed. Each decision appeared insignificant. Together, they became catastrophic. As investigators assembled the final timeline, a disturbing pattern emerged. The company had multiple opportunities to change course. Not one, not two, multiple opportunities. At various points, someone could have stopped and asked difficult questions. Someone could have demanded a deeper review. Someone could have insisted on immediate action. Had that happened, the outcome might have been completely different. But those moments came and went. The organization kept moving forward. The warnings accumulated. The vulnerabilities expanded. The risks increased. And because the consequences remained hidden, there was never enough urgency to force meaningful change. One investigator later summarized the entire disaster with a statement that many people inside the company found difficult to argue with. He said the company didn't fail because it lacked intelligence. It failed because it kept postponing uncomfortable decisions. That observation struck at the heart of what happened. Because when people hear about a $217 million loss, they often imagine one catastrophic event, one disastrous moment, one obvious failure. The reality was much more complicated and much more relatable. The loss wasn't created when the crisis erupted. The loss wasn't created when executives rushed into emergency meetings. The loss wasn't created when headlines appeared or investors panicked. By then, the outcome was already taking shape. The real damage had been accumulating quietly for months, perhaps even years. One decision at a time, one delay at a time, one ignored warning at a time. Which brings us back to Daniel Reeves. For a long time, people believed his email represented the moment this story began. Investigators eventually reached a different conclusion. The email wasn't the beginning. It was the final opportunity. The last clear warning before events moved beyond anyone's control. And that's what makes this story so haunting. Because once you understand the timeline, the disaster almost feels inevitable. Not because anyone wanted it to happen, but because every warning was treated as tomorrow's problem. And tomorrow kept arriving. Until eventually there were no more tomorrows left. The $217 million loss wasn't created in a single day. It was created every time someone decided to wait until tomorrow. In the years that followed, countless people tried to explain what happened. Regulators produced reports. Law firms completed investigations. Analysts published opinions. Executives defended decisions. Shareholders demanded accountability. And yet, despite all the documents, interviews, hearings, and reviews, the story always seemed to return to the same place. An inbox, a message, a warning, a choice. Because when all the complexity is stripped away, that's where this story truly lives. Not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, not inside a financial report, but in a moment so ordinary that almost everyone watching this video has experienced it. An email arrives. You're busy. A meeting is about to start. A deadline is approaching. The message doesn't seem urgent. You'll look at it later. And later never comes. That is what makes this story so powerful. The loss of $217 million wasn't caused by a dramatic villain. It wasn't caused by some elaborate conspiracy. It wasn't caused by one reckless decision made in the heat of the moment. It was caused by something much more familiar. Assumptions, complacency, delay, the belief that there will always be time tomorrow to deal with today's concerns. For Michael Carter, the disaster would become a defining chapter of his career. For shareholders, it became a costly lesson about risk and oversight. For employees, it became a reminder that even successful companies are vulnerable when warnings go unanswered. And for Daniel Reeves, it became proof of something he had understood long before anyone else. Problems don't become dangerous because they exist. They become dangerous when nobody acts. Looking back, the most remarkable part of this story isn't that Daniel sent the email. It's that he was right. Months before the crisis. Months before the investigations. Months before the headlines. The warning was already there. Waiting. Documented. Delivered. And that's the detail that continues to haunt everyone who studied this case. Because unlike many corporate disasters, this one didn't arrive without warning. The company wasn't blindsided. The evidence wasn't hidden. The risk wasn't invisible. The warning reached exactly where it was supposed to go. The opportunity to prevent the disaster existed. The opportunity to ask difficult questions existed. The opportunity to slow down and investigate existed. But opportunities only matter when someone acts on them. And in this case, nobody did. Most disasters don't arrive screaming. They arrive quietly. A report, a warning, a phone call, an email, something small enough to ignore, until it becomes too large to stop. That may be the most important lesson from the entire story. Not just for corporations, not just for executives, for everyone. Because the biggest problems in life rarely begin as big problems. They begin as small concerns, minor inconsistencies, tiny warning signs, subtle signals that something deserves attention. The people who avoid disaster aren't always the smartest. They aren't always the most experienced. Often, they're simply the people willing to pay attention when others don't. And that's why the image of Daniel Reeves' email remains so powerful. Not because it contains secret information, not because it predicted the exact future, but because it represented a chance to change the outcome, a chance that quietly slipped away. The warning was delivered. The opportunity to prevent it existed. But nobody listened. So what do you think? Was this disaster caused by one person's mistake? Or was it caused by an entire system that slowly stopped paying attention to the warnings right in front of it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because we genuinely love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more videos.